All right. Well, hello. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We're really honored to have Charlie Bolden and Mike Coates with us today. We're going to talk about diversity and inclusion, what it means to all of us, and how important it is to NASA. I did want to mention that Administrator Breitenstein recently announced that NASA's new course value will be inclusion, and he stated that NASA is committed to a culture of diversity, inclusion, and equity where all employees feel welcome, respected, and engaged. So this is an important topic from the very top of NASA. We certainly feel that way at JSC, and I know these two gentlemen had a big role, I think, in getting NASA to where it is today, to have these kind of conversations, especially here at JSC. So I want to thank them for the time. I'm going to go through and give a little bio of our two guests today, and then we'll go through questions. At the end, or toward the end, we actually have members of our employee resource groups that are going to ask questions also. So we're going to have a great conversation for the next hour. So let me start real quick with Charlie Bolden. You know, we all know Charlie here at JSC, of course, at NASA. He was also, though, very importantly, the 12th administrator of NASA, a really big job. Served until, I think, January of 17, right, Charlie, right in that time frame.
Right.
So did a great job. A lot of things really kicked off under Charlie, including really turning Commercial Crew into a real program, which we're now really living the benefits of today. I'll start back. Charlie was raised in South Carolina. He went to the U.S. Naval Academy and graduated in 1968. Interestingly enough, the same year that Mike graduated from the Naval Academy. Charlie became a naval aviator and flew more than 100 combat missions in his time. So incredible service to this country. He had a 34-year career in the Marines, which also included his time as an astronaut. He joined the astronaut office in 1980, and he went to orbit 4 times. So Charlie has been a great public servant and incredible leader for NASA. Then Mike Coates, a lot of us know Mike from many times that he's been here. Of course, he started, born in California, also went to the Naval Academy, also graduated in 1968. He was a A-7E pilot and actually flew hundreds of missions in Vietnam as well. So also served his country incredibly in that time, difficult time. He came to NASA in 1978 as part of the 35 New Guys class, which was a historic class for NASA, the first group coming in to fly, specifically to fly the shuttle. Mike flew in space 3 times. Was a big leader for the crew office in that time period. He left and went to private industry for a while, but then he came back and was served as the 10th director of the Johnson Space Center until his retirement in December of 2012. So thank you guys for being here. Thanks for what you did for this country and for NASA, but I really appreciate that you're here sharing specifically on your passion and the role you had in really helping NASA understand and grow in diversity and inclusion. So I have a few questions. So I'll start with the first one. You both served in significant leadership roles. When you accepted the positions, what was your perception? So when you started, what was your perception of the value of diversity in the agency? And what drove you to prioritize creating a diverse culture?
I guess I'll start. Since Mike's older than I am, I'll help him out. Mike is. I'll tell you a couple of things about him. Mike and I are classmates, as you mentioned, Mark. And I tell people all the time, and it's not intended to embarrass Mike, but I tell people all the time, from the moment I met him, he was never a junior midshipman. We were plebes together, but Mike always had this air of maturity and everything else, unlike the rest of us snotty-nosed kids coming out of high school. And so I have actually admired him throughout our lives together, which now, geez, we're about to celebrate a 55th anniversary in a couple of years from the Naval Academy. But he's always been a great friend and an ally. But going back to your question, having come out of the Naval Academy, the Marine Corps, and actually having grown up in the segregated South, I had a real appreciation for the importance of diversity and inclusion, and a term that's been added recently, equity, had an appreciation for it from my childhood, because I knew that things that I was not able to do, if we were able to integrate society at that time, better schools, better access to healthcare, all the same kinds of things we're hearing about today, particularly in this COVID-19 environment, when we're looking at underlying causes and finding out that the disparity that's caused by race and gender sometimes, but economic opportunities, is really leading us to some really bad things.
Well, let me start off saying I'm not a sociologist. My wife actually majored in sociology, and I majored in engineering. So we somehow overcame the language barrier. And then now I'm just a happily retired grandfather. So I don't pretend to be an expert on social issues, if you will. But it does seem to me, after 50 some years, watching the world around us, that either you believe diversity is a strength or you don't believe that diversity is a strength. And many countries around the world, my experience is that they don't think diversity is a strength. Mm-hmm. And gives you an advantage. So I happen to believe that gives us, because we're a very diverse country, a huge advantage as we're competing for world leadership. And I'm a pretty competitive guy, so I think if my team has more diverse players, then it's more creative, and we have a better opportunity to win. And it really comes down to that. It's a simple thing. So I want the best and the brightest talent from every segment of the society. And I don't care where it comes from. I want the best players. And I believe that if I have the best players and the best information, then I have a better opportunity to win. And it doesn't matter if it's on the playing field or the battlefield or worrying about our grandchildren's futures. I like to win. I hate to lose. So that's kind of where I come from in diversity. I believe it's a huge strength, and we ought to value it as a very precious commodity in this country, because I think it really does give us a big advantage. So when I came to JSC, to get to your question, inclusion wasn't just a buzzword. To me, it was something that I thought was critical to achieving our JSC mission. And again, I viewed the JSA mission was to be the world leader in human space exploration. So I asked the senior staff to implement the Inclusion and Innovation Program at JSC. And of course, a key part of that program was the employee resource groups. And they did a fantastic job of setting that up. We did some benchmarking around the country against other organizations to find out what problems they'd have and if they had any lessons learned that we could benefit from. So we spent a lot of time talking to other, believe it or not, we talked to a Toyota Motor Factory in Indiana and to the Georgia Power people in Atlanta and so forth. And not only did we talk to a lot of the people that had set up their programs, but I talked to the executives and said, what would you do differently in hindsight? And it was really worthwhile for me to learn from their mistakes, if you will. But when we set up the ERGs, remember we'd had affinity groups before that at JSC, and that's while I was gone, so I wasn't really that familiar with them, but for some reason that hadn't worked out very well. And one of the things that I learned from our benchmarking was you need to make it clear to the ERGs that their mandate and their goal was to help JSC achieve our mission, okay? Which meant their focus needed to be on helping us recruit and then mentoring individuals from their segment of society, making them feel welcome and a contributing member from day one. And that was the mandate. And I think it made a big difference. And boy, did they jump on that. All the ERGs, at least back in my time, did a terrific job of doing exactly that.
Yep, thank you. And yeah, Mike, I would comment on that. I think sometimes people look at the ERGs and they think, wow, we're actually trying to separate the team, right, and around these things. But you said it. It really, because the center provides emphasis and values this, right, it actually improves inclusion of these folks into the bigger JSC, right? They feel wanted, right, and they feel included. And so I think, and the way you said it too, helping the mission, gets them pointed toward the mission too. It's really, really been a very powerful example.
Hey, Mark, if I can add one thing based
Sure.
on what you both just said, there's a headline this morning in the Wall Street Journal and several other places where the CEO of Wells Fargo, one of the largest banks in the world, made a statement to many of his employees and to some other executives that as much as he really was striving for diversity in Wells Fargo, he had to admit that the pool of talent for minorities just wasn't there. And I found that to be absurd. Mike has heard me say this before. The pool is giant. We just have to figure out which part of it to go into. It's sort of like people talk about thinking out of the box. There's so much room in the box that we don't ever use. Mike and I as test pilots, we spend a lot of time in the corners of the box where people don't generally go, because that's what we're supposed to do. Find out where you break an airplane or where the airplane doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And I think what the ERGs allow us to do is to look into the corners of the box, places that we never looked before, to bring people into the workforce that we just would not find in a normal manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you, Charlie. I think, and still the NASA logo has a lot of power. We can go, if we focus on it, we can recruit the people that we want, right? And that we need to make our mission successful. That's a great point. So the second question really gives you a chance to talk about your life experience. So how has your life experience shaped your view of the importance of diversity and inclusion?
Well, let me, if Charlie doesn't mind, I'll tackle that one first. As Mark said, Charlie and I came to the Naval Academy at the same time. And Charlie came from South Carolina and I came from Southern California. So it was one country, but two different worlds completely. I grew up in Southern California in a fully integrated school system. We had about, 20% of our schools were minority, Hispanic and African American. And so we had teammates and classmates and friends that were minorities, and we thought that was natural. And that was just the way it is. And I'm sure we had some subtle discrimination problems that I was probably oblivious to. But, I saw one world growing up out there. And then I went back to the Naval Academy. And boy, was I shocked. Yeah, Charlie's laughing there, but you got to remember, here I traveled cross country to the state of Maryland, where Annapolis was. And Maryland was very much a southern state. They wanted to actually join a confederacy, and they weren't allowed to do that because that would have put Washington, D.C. deep in the Confederacy. But for the first time in my life, I encountered real racism. And boy, was it a shock to me. And I'm sure Charlie can certainly tell more vivid stories than I can. But and I can tell you lots and lots of stories about, we had some racist midshipmen, but we also lived in a racist town in a very southern state, if you will. And boy, was it a shock to me. I was really impressed when this young black kid, who I don't think he'd turned 18 yet, Charlie, came around knocking on our doors while we were plebes, running for class president. And I shared a room with 3 other midshipmen plebes. And Charlie, we were afraid to step out and show our heads, of course, as new plebes. And here Charlie is going around meeting everybody. And when he left after he introduced himself, one of our roommates said, "Well, I don't know if he's crazy or really, really brave, but I'm going to vote for him for class president." And I think most of us did. So we got to meet Charlie from a very young age, probably before he turned 18, if you will. Then later in my career, I happened to be on the Kitty Hawk when we were flying combat missions off Vietnam when we had the race riot. And I don't know if you're aware of that, but we had a full-fledged race riot in the middle of the war, if you will. We had gangs of black kids and white kids literally battling for control of our nation's finest warship. Fortunately, they called out the Marines, who didn't really care about any color other than green, and they knocked heads and quickly restored order, or eventually restored order. But it was a real shock to me because the investigation showed that we, in fact, had some racist old line chiefs on the ship who hadn't let some of the young black kids off the ship in 6 months. And it was really a pretty grim story. It doesn't justify the riots, of course, but it opened my eyes an awful lot to how the Navy had to come a long ways. And I think they came a long ways eventually, but they were pulled into the 20th century kicking and screaming, if you will. So I could relate a lot of other examples of how I grew up as kind of a naive West Coast kid. And I learned the hard way that we really do have racists in our society. We still have racists in our society. Some of them are rogue cops and policemen out there. I hope that we've come a long ways from what Charlie saw growing up. But Charlie's perspectives are a whole lot more important than mine. So I'd like to hear Charlie talk about his background.
No, I think, Mike, I think your perspective is incredibly valuable because it's because of the way it contrasts to the way I grew up. I grew up in the segregated South in Columbia, South Carolina, and there were rules, and you knew where you could go and where you couldn't. You knew which drinking fountain you could drink from because they were labeled, white and colored, and there were no bathrooms as a general rule in public places, and you couldn't eat in public places. So when I came to Annapolis as a plebe, I was right at home in Annapolis and in the state of Maryland. It was just like being back in South Carolina for the most part, except it was a little bit more loose. The only other time I had been with that many white guys was the 2 summers, the summer before my junior year in high school and before my senior year in high school, when I was fortunate enough to get selected for National Science Foundation programs. And I went to a place called North Manchester, Indiana, to Manchester College for a program in chemistry where there were only 2 blacks on the campus, one young lady who was a college student and me. And so we got to know each other, but still, that was my original introduction to moving into a quote unquote integrated society. And then just before my senior year, I went to what was then Carnegie Tech, now Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And that was really different because it was pretty doggone diverse, pretty well integrated in everything. And so that helped me a little bit. But as I said, when I came to the Naval Academy, segregation, was still sort of the law of the land in many places. And I found that I had a little bit more freedom, but what I had to do was I had to be very, very careful in selecting things I tried to do. There were 7 blacks in my class when we got there, and by the end of plebe year, we were down to 4, and the 4 of us stayed together and graduated together. And but I remember a lot of places where our classmates would go for a beer just outside the liberty limits, where you could do that. We didn't go because we knew we would not be welcome. And I remember one night after the brigade boxing championships, my first class year, when I lost again in the brigade championship, and we wanted to go vent, so we decided we'd go out to one of these bars and have a beer with everybody else. And we walked in and went up to the bar, and the bartender was very courteous, but he said, I'm sorry, I can't serve you here. If you go around the back, I'll bring you a beer or something, but you can't stay. And I just told him I wasn't leaving. Either he could call the police or I could call him, but I wasn't leaving. And one of the things that struck me, that stayed with me the rest of my career, was one of our classmates at the time, turned his back as I was going through this with the bartender and sort of slid away from the bar And unfortunately, he became a Marine, and I served with him for my 34 years in the Marine Corps. And he and I became general officers. And when I got ready to retire from the Marine Corps, I was actually, I knew him, and I had decided I was going to retire, but it wasn't certain. And I called him for a little counsel, and all he had to say was, okay. It made me go back to that night in the bar in Annapolis, and it taught me that, you know, you can talk to people all you want, but you can't change them. You know, you just have to do what you know is the right thing and do the best you can do, and maybe they'll come along. But he evidently did not come along, because 34 years later, he was the same guy he was in the bar that night. And so, you know, I don't think I was surprised. But so I just had a little bit different perspective. And I had really struggled to get into the Naval Academy because I couldn't get an appointment from South Carolina, from either of my, U.S. senators or my representative. One of my senators was the notorious Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond and Olin D. Johnston were the senators, and Albert Watson was the congressional representative. And the three of them made it very clear. I had been talking to them since 10th grade about wanting to go to the Naval Academy. And when I finally wrote my application to them, they made it very clear that there was no way in the world they were going to appoint a black out of South Carolina. And so I actually got my appointment by working through first Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who became president our senior year in high school, and ended up getting an appointment from Congressman William Dawson in Chicago, Illinois. And I got to the Naval Academy in plebe summer. I hated it after wanting to go since I was 12 years old. And I'd call home every weekend and cry to my mom and dad and tell them I wanted to come home. And my father, who had been my high school football coach, would tell me one thing, and he told it to me every single week when I called: hang in there one more week. And I said, but I don't want to be here. And he said, hang in there one more week. So for 52 weeks, I hung in there. But the real thing that caused me to stay was two second-class midshipmen who were on our plebe detail, one from South Carolina and another one from Alabama, who walked into my room one night. They were in my company, and they were on the plebe detail. And they walked in and said, Mr. Bolden, we just want to let you know you're not going to get through here. And I said, well, sirs, what's going to keep me from doing that? And they said, we are. We're not going to let you get through plebe year. And I said, well, I think I probably have something to say about that, so we'll see. And although I still didn't want to be at the Naval Academy, I could not leave. So, inadvertently, in threatening me that they were going to make sure that I did not get through, they were the big reason that I stayed, because I just refused to let them drive me out. And I say that to any minorities, particularly women, who are participating in this forum today. You cannot let people drive you out. You cannot let them discourage you. You just set your goals and you do what you know is best, and eventually they'll come around.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike and Charlie. Incredible stories, and we're talking about the late 70s, right? We're not talking about 1932.
No,
yeah.
Talking about the 60s, the late 60s, because we graduated in 68. So the 70s were just as bad. I ended up
Charlie.
In Mississippi in the early 70s, and when I came to Houston, that's another story. Also, there, we had to go. Jackie and I, when we finally found a house, we had to go to Pasadena. Mike knows Pasadena very well. Pasadena is a big oil town right on the Texas Gulf Coast. And so we had to go into Pasadena to get our electricity turned on. And I remember driving into Pasadena from Clear Lake and seeing this billboard with a big horseman on a white horse reared up and a hood on, and it was a Klan sign, a billboard in 1980 going into Pasadena that said, "Welcome to Pasadena, heart of the Ku Klux Klan." And I went back home and I told Jackie, I said, I don't believe it. I cannot believe that here we are in 1980 and we've still got this stuff going on. And but you learn to live with it and do the best that you can to overcome it and convince people that it's not the right thing to do. And eventually the churches down in our area were the ones that kind of drove the Klan out, that told them they weren't welcome when they started trying to burn some of the Vietnamese fishing boats down where we live.
I remember that. Well, let's see. So as you, in your role at NASA, probably more so when you were leaders like administrator and center director. I imagine you saw some challenges in your attempts to build diversity. So how do you account for those challenges in your strategy? How did you account for that and deal with that in your strategies?
You want to go first, Mike? Because I thought you did an incredible job from the vantage point of Washington, looking down at the 9 centers plus JPL.
Well, I was actually pleasantly surprised with the reaction I got from the JSC workforce. And I think it comes down to whether you believe, again, that diversity is a benefit or not. And does it help you achieve your mission and your goals in life or not? If you really value it and think it's important, then you're more likely to listen to others and learn from life's lessons that other people have done. You don't have to make all your own mistakes. You can listen to other people and hopefully avoid some of those. And I think it makes communications easier if, in fact, you're more open-minded about what other people have to say. If you think you already have all the answers, and believe it or not, when I was an astronaut, and when I came back and talked with some of the previous center directors, when I was coming back as center director, I interviewed an awful lot of them. Chris Kraft and Aaron Cohen and Roy Estes and Carolyn Huntoon and so forth. And a common theme from them was that JSC, if they had a problem, it was the not invented here attitude. You can call it arrogance if you want, but they weren't especially open-minded, if you will. I was fortunate when I took the job. It was a year after the Columbia tragedy, and I found the workforce very open-minded, very willing to listen to others. I didn't encounter the attitude that we had all the answers. Now we had some issues. One of them was me, and I had what Mark referred to as a concern that, okay, we're going to set up these separate employee resource groups. How is that integrated together? Or if we're intentionally separating out people, how does that work? And that's a question I had for a lot of the companies and organizations we benchmark against. And eventually they had to convince me that it would help, believe it or not, make everybody appreciate and understand people of a different background and experience. But they had to sell me on it, and I had to convince myself that it was going to be a benefit to JSC. But I was very fortunate that I think the workforce was actually pretty open-minded when I came back.
I guess I would piggyback saying that, as I mentioned, I thought observing, again, from on high, if you will, from DC, JSC was actually a real strong leader when it came to diversity and inclusion. And I really attributed it to Mike's leadership. One of the examples I'll give you is that my major concern coming in as the NASA administrator was the lack of diversity in the leadership. When I came in, we didn't have any female center directors. We had no, Mike Woodrow Whitlow, he had not become center director at Glenn yet. So we had no people of color who were center directors. And I think that was the same case for deputies. And then Mike brought Ellen up to be his deputy for a long time and groomed her. And, when he mentioned to me that he wanted to retire, I was heartbroken, but I said, I got it. And then he mentioned the fact that he really strongly recommended that Ellen come up and take his place as the center director, which made me incredibly happy because, again, it was going to give us something we really needed, a female or in this case, it was a female to lead a major center in the agency. And that speaks volumes because she became the face and voice of the Johnson Space Center to be seen and heard around the world, because people don't realize NASA is, in my opinion, next to maybe the State Department, and even aspects of DOD.
It's 11 o'clock.
We're the strongest soft power instrument that the U.S. government has. Nobody is as powerful as NASA in terms of people wanting to follow the U.S. And you see it in everything we do and everywhere we go. And I knew that, boy, we were finally going to have a female representing NASA in Israel and maybe Saudi Arabia or other places where women may not even be thought of as leaders. And so we were going to have Ellen. And then eventually we had Lisa Rowe and we had Janet. And it began to become not uncommon. Mike helped me to get a thing started that was called we had a Diversity and Inclusion Council at NASA headquarters. And I designated myself the diversity champion for the agency because I believe that if I didn't show how strongly I believed in it, it wasn't going to happen. And that's the same thing that Mike and a number of the center directors finally did. I did not require a center director to be the diversity champion for the center, but I said it had to be somebody who could speak for him so that people in the workforce, contractor and NASA workforce, knew that anytime they talked about diversity, inclusion, and eventually equity, that it was coming from the center director. So that was, just some of the early initiatives that we did.
Good. Yeah. Thank you. And let's see. I'll give a little my own experience under Mike. So at that time, I was the Orion program manager, and so I remember also Mike starting this, or let's say providing energy and changing some things around this, and being supportive. But I really want to pull on what Charlie said. The thing at Johnson that we have to be careful about is everybody is so busy, right? And we are focused on the mission. So it takes the boss to go, hey, this is so important. I know you're busy and I know the program's important, but you need to do this. And my journey, and just to be honest, so because I didn't want to go, too much into, but my bringing up, I kind of lived in a bubble, and it's not because my parents tried to put me in a bubble, but just where we lived, I had very little experience with other cultures, very little. And Mike said, everybody needs to take this class, right? It was required. And I remember thinking, how am I going to fit this in my schedule? But hey, Mike thinks this is important. And I can tell you that first training, it's not that I didn't want to go. It's not that I resisted. I don't want to learn these things. It was a time thing. It was a workload thing. And then when I went, it completely changed my view of the things I did not understand. And then the training that we did still under Mike and then Ellen really opened my eyes. And if it hadn't been for Mike saying, I know you're busy, but you need to do this, I would not have done it. I'm just be honest. And that's the struggle here. When it's mission focused and holy cow, we're doing COFR and we're about to fly another flight, it takes the boss to go, this is important for the country. This is important for JSC to be the team that we need to be. And anyway, I just want to affirm both of you because you hit on it. It takes the boss to say, or these things will not change. And so I just want to thank both of you for that. So let's see. So I'm going to skip a little bit because we're doing great, but I think one of the questions has kind of already been answered. But do you remember a specific experience where you wish that you would have done something differently? And it can be, your NASA experience or others. So do you remember a specific experience where you wish you would have done something differently relative to this topic?
You got an answer, Mike.
Well, I never made any mistakes, so I didn't do anything different. Yeah, okay, I'll tell you a very personal one that I've regretted ever since, and it has to do with the race issue. When I was at the Naval Academy, we used to bring in our girlfriends for dates, and they could stay with some of the elderly ladies that owned homes in Annapolis. And I had a girl come in, and I don't remember, I think it was during my youngster year, my sophomore year. And I'm talking to the lady that owned the house. Well, my girlfriend is getting ready to come downstairs. And the sweet little old lady, and she said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "California." And she looked at me with a straight face and said, "Why'd you ever let those blacks come into California?" Except she didn't use the word blacks. And I was flabbergasted. I mean, for once in my life, I was totally speechless. And it crossed my mind to say some pretty profane things to her, but how do I do this with my date coming down here? Unfortunately, the date came down just at the right time, so I didn't say what I was thinking. But I've always regretted that I didn't speak up and say, what kind of world are you living in here? But like I said, that was one of the shocks to find myself in a southern state where people actually thought like that. And I wish I had handled that differently. Probably would have gone to jail, but.
Mine is sort of along the same line as Mike, and it has to do with not speaking up when you know something's wrong. You know, I mentioned the fact that the bar in our senior year at the Naval Academy, when I watched my classmate turn his back and walk away, and I never approached him about that. And I served, like I said, 34 years in the Marine Corps with him. And I never said anything about it. And I have never said anything to him about it to this day. And yet it evidently bothered me and bothers me because I still remember it. If it didn't, I wouldn't be talking about it. But I think I think it's really important. And this is not just for minorities or women. This is for everybody. None of us can fix a problem if we don't know the problem exists. And this is particularly for our white employees. You know, this is not easy for you. Let me tell you, I can only imagine what it would be like to be a young white man today in this world of people talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, particularly equity, because equity means making things right. It means looking back on things that we didn't do correctly and finding a way to make up for it, which means somebody's going to end up in a place that they would not ordinarily have been because although they should have been there, discrimination kept them from being there. So it's really important for somebody who feels that they're being slighted by that to seek out their supervisor and say, "Hey, I don't get it. You got to help me here." And if the supervisor can't explain it, if the only reason is, well, because they told me to do it, then that's bad. That person is definitely not a leader. He or she is a manager, but they're not a leader, because a leader will be able to explain, just as Mike started out this session, why is diversity important? If we can't explain that to people, we're in trouble. You know, I was privileged to have a meeting with Martin, who people will hear from later. Martin, as a Marine, will appreciate this. You don't get to meet the commandant very often, but the commandant invited me to come over and talk to him. The commandant of the Marine Corps, by the way. That's not like the commandant of the Naval Academy, although that's a big deal too. And so there I was sitting in the office with the commandant of the Marine Corps, and he's asking me questions about diversity and stuff. And I mean, I was flabbergasted that he would ask, first of all. But one of the first questions he asked, he said, "You know, I know why it's important, but what do you tell people? I can't just tell Marines that it's going to make us better. I've got to be able to show them, and I've got to be able to explain to them in a way that they will understand how it makes us better." And I think that's our struggle, is that we are unable to explain to young people or old people who don't understand why we're doing this. Things were perfectly okay. We've been working for, NASA's been around for 60 some odd years. Things were perfectly okay. So why the hell do you want to come in and upset things? Why do you want to change? And if we can't explain to them the value of it, and we can't show them how incredibly valuable diversity has been to this agency through the years, and it goes even into international relationships. If we can't explain to them why having international partners is critically important, then we probably ought to sit back and think about it a little bit longer and think about our leadership skills, because that stuff is really, really, really important. It is the reason that we are looked upon the way that we are around the world. It's because people see how we function, and they see that we are diverse, and they say, damn, maybe there is something in that stuff. And especially when they come here and visit, and they go to, all they need to do is visit 2 NASA centers and see the difference in cultures. And they say, how the hell do those guys, how do they launch rocket ships? I'm in Stennis, and it's like being in one country, and then I go to Langley, and it's like being in another country, and then I go out to Ames, and holy shit, those guys are really off the page. But that's what makes us so very good, is because we get this diversity of thought and diversity of ideas that come from these different cultures that each center brings. And, I just think that's what makes us as great as we are. And I think it's important.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Charlie. I think what's interesting about your 2 stories, the value because you've seen the worst of it, and you don't have to be told how bad that is.
Yeah.
Mike is more like me. I didn't experience it. I had comments. I've had things like Mike, where somebody who was a friend of the family said something. I'm like, God, where the hell have you been? But that's the limit of my experience of the negativity of it. So Mike has to explain it to those of us that haven't lived it, right? And I think you said it really well, Charlie. How do you do that really matters. I think Mike did a great job going to the core of why we are here. We're here to successfully launch people. We're here to expand presence in this. Everybody gets that. And if you can tie that to this makes it more likely we'll succeed, I think that resonated with the workforce. But it is funny. It's not funny. It's interesting how you have to talk to different groups, because if they haven't lived it, they don't see the value. And these things that Mike made us go, it was a required class. I learned things I never knew before. And you said it. How are you going to get it if you don't understand the truth? And it takes some of that eye-opening to really understand it. And then for me, you have to get past Mike's got a good example where he feels bad about not standing up. I took this class, and frankly, I was overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. There's so much. And part of that is then going, well, today I'm going to do something, right? I'm going to move forward. I'm not going to lock up, right? I'm going to move forward. And part of that is then under Mike's leadership and Ellen's also learning what to do to make this difference and looking for those barriers. But no, those are great examples. And I really do think that talking about how it makes us better to do the missions we're given really resonates with people. But it is interesting. You have to communicate differently to people who haven't lived it.
Yeah.
And I think those are great examples. Let me ask one. So in the converse, so both of you have done really, really incredibly well in leading in these areas. What are the things that you're the most proud of that you did that you felt was the most effective relative to diversity inclusion? And maybe you've already touched on that, but I thought this would give you a chance to say, hey, here's something that we did when I was here, or I did that I thought really made a difference relative to this.
Well, I think one of the things that benefited me, and I think our senior staff, is that we started benchmarking against other organizations. I learned the value of benchmarking at Lockheed Martin when I left the astronaut office and went out to industry. Aerospace industry was collapsing on itself, and companies were merging, if you will. And Lockheed Martin, which was made up of more than a dozen former independent companies, suddenly we were faced with doing internal benchmarking to find out which of those companies had the best engineering processes, the best financial processes, the best human resources process, so forth. And the companies were generally shocked to find out they weren't the best necessarily. Lockheed was a good engineering company that declared bankruptcy twice. Martin Marietta really knew their financial stuff and so forth. So we had to benchmark learn to benchmark internally, and then to accept it, for the employees to accept the fact that their arch competitors their whole careers were suddenly their compatriots and might have done something better was really tough for them. So learning to benchmark internally and sell it was quite a lesson for me. So when I got to JSC and we started talking about inclusion and innovation, I wanted to go benchmark against other companies and see what they had done out there. And we did that, and I learned an awful lot from it. And one of the advantages, and Mark touched on it before, one of the advantages of working for NASA is that people want to say to their boards of directors or to their shareholders or to their colleagues, we teamed with NASA. Okay, so we didn't have to pay to learn all these lessons that they had learned so painfully out there. And they were eager to share with us. And when I sat down one-on-one with the presidents of these organizations, they were very open to sharing what they had done right and what they had done wrong out there. So we have a huge advantage being NASA that we need to take advantage. Our brand name is terrific, and Charlie alluded to it before. We're very highly thought of by the public. And we need to take advantage of that, and we need to continue, I think, to set the example of the proper way to do things. People actually listen and they watch. And just as leaders need to set the right example, I think NASA needs to continue to set the right example. Not only being successful in space exploration, but also setting the example in other ways in our society.
Real quickly, I think there are tons of things that I'm proud of, but I think two that I'll give you. One's the Marine Corps, and one's with NASA, and both of them were listening. I'll give you the NASA one first. Mike may remember Jerry Buchholz. Jerry was probably the best hire I ever made when she came in to become the Human Capital Officer, the Associate Administrator for Human Capital, or whatever we called him. And every day, Jerry would find me and she would say, thank somebody and tell somebody what a great job they're doing today. Make sure you do that every single day. And Jerry took NASA and she led us to become the best place to work in the federal government. And the agency hasn't looked back since. That was, I want to say, 8-9 years ago. And it's because Jerry was the one that really convinced me that the key to becoming a really good agency was letting the workforce know how valuable they were and how proud you were of them and how important their work was, no matter what that work was. And I remember bringing the president's chief of staff now, Mark Meadows, who is former congressman from North Carolina, who was not very friendly to government workers, but he was the chairman of a committee, and he was getting ready to embark on a hearing about the worst places in the federal government, because he was trying to give people some examples of how you fire people. And we were working with the Partnership for Public Service quite a bit back then, and they made a recommendation to him that he, rather than go out and look at the worst places to work in the federal government, that he come over or have me come over and talk to him about what we did at NASA. And I spent about 2 hours with him in his office, and then invited him to come over to NASA headquarters. And I told him I would give him 2 hours with every employee in the agency. And he said, how are you going to do that? I said, well, we're going to put you in a conference room, and we're going to let you, it wasn't Zoom. I forget what we do when we do our weekly tag up, but I said, you're going to have as many people as you want to talk to for 2 hours about this agency, and I'm not even going to be in the room. And I had mentioned to him that even the custodians felt that they played a role in getting people to Mars. And when he walked in the building, when he came up to my office, he said, I have to say, I don't believe it. I think you set it up. But he said, I asked several people on my way up here, what do you do or whatever it was. And he talked about the custodian and told him that I'm helping to send people to Mars. And, he was sufficiently moved that he never did the hearing on the worst places to work, but he started looking at good things in the federal government. I don't know that we did any good because I don't think he's any better, but that's neither here nor there. And then the second thing is listening to a young first lieutenant who was working for me when I was the commanding general of the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, and we were getting ready to go to war. We knew we were. This is, after 9/11, and I was really concerned about the Marines and their families, and that they were able to become the best warfighting machine that we had. And I knew that if they were concerned about their families back home and stuff like that, then they would be potentially ineffective. And so we put out a campaign plan that was called Putting Marines First. And we emphasized 3 things. One was physical wellness, which was no problem whatsoever with Marines, because that's all they do is they're in shape. The second one was mental wellness, and there we wanted to emphasize to them that in combat, you're going to be afraid. There are going to be times when you're afraid. If you're not, something's wrong with you, and it's okay to say that, and it's okay to seek out help from the mental health specialist or anybody, because that's really important. We need you whole. And the third thing was spiritual wellness, and it was for those who were people of faith, that they be allowed to practice that faith no matter what it was without being harassed by anybody. Particularly, we had a lot of Muslims, and so it was really important. And we also had atheists. And I said, that's their faith. And that's okay. We've got to give everybody room enough to understand that whatever they choose as their form of faith is okay, so that they can be spiritually well. And so those are 2 of the things that I think, I was really proud of when we did them.
Great. Yep. Great examples. Hey, so now we're going to go to some questions from folks from our employee resource groups. Hopefully we'll have time to get them all in, but certainly we'll get a few. So I'm going to hand it over to Isidro Reyna to go ahead and call on folks, and they'll ask their questions.
Thank you, Mark, Mike, and Charlie, for the candid conversation. Like Mark mentioned, we do have our employees from our employee resource groups here. We're going to start today with Jennifer Mason.
Good morning. I want to thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. That was so powerful. I'm here as a member of the Out and Allied ERG, which represents the LGBTQ employees and their allies. And my question is, as we look at changes that have to occur for us to become the NASA of tomorrow, some changes may require us to let go of the NASA of yesterday. And that can be very scary for some people, as you have touched on. So what I'd like to know is, what do you think we need to let go of in the name of inclusion? What do we need to embrace? And why is it important for our culture and our mission? Thank you.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Oh, let me tell you, there is so much to let go of. Can I use commercial crew or commercial space flight as an example? That was so foreign to us when we started. And again, I go back, Mike, I credit Mike and Bob Cabana. If you want to know why we're successful in those 2 areas, I think it's because of Mike and Bob Cabana. We had to decide how those programs were going to be run, because nobody liked them anyway, because it meant that NASA was going to lose control of something. And so Mike and Bob decided, and I'm not sure whether they arm wrestled or whether they threatened each other or what, but they decided that they would split the program leadership, and they would put commercial crew headquartered down at the Cape and commercial cargo, since we were already running that out of JSC, that we would do that and allow, the people to try to come along as best we could. And I think the programs are as strong as they are today because we finally allowed ourselves to accept the fact that NASA didn't know everything. and that there were other ways of doing things.
Yeah, let me pile on to that. Getting back to what I mentioned before, the not invented here attitude that NASA had and certainly JSC had, and some of it was certainly justified. I mean, we won the race to the moon. We made this space shuttle work. We built a space station. We've been wildly successful, I think, as an agency. Made our mistakes, but we've really accomplished a tremendous amount in the first 6 or 7 decades of human spaceflight. But it's important now that we open our minds, if you will, and pay attention. And we've learned a lot from the commercial spaceflight companies. And they've been, in my experiences, and Mark can address it better than I can, but they've actually been fairly open to asking for NASA's advice. Now, we were, when they first started the commercial effort, we were told by Congress, don't tell the commercial companies what to do. They're more creative and innovative and so forth. So we, in essence, had to keep our mouths shut unless we were asked. And fortunately, my experience is they asked, and we were able to pass on our lessons learned, some of them very painful, if you will. And we've, I think we've done an awful lot. We've made some mistakes, and maybe Mark can address it better than I can now because I'm an outsider now. But SpaceX did a wonderful job because I think we were watching them very carefully because they were new players on the block. Boeing may have made some mistakes because they were old hat. We knew them, and we didn't pay as much attention to them. Okay, and that's a lesson learned, I think, for us. We've got to continue to be more accepting and actually seek out different opinions and dissenting opinions and listen to them. Learning to listen is the hardest thing we do. People skills are really tough to come by. I wish I had some. Wish Charlie could give me some of them.
All right.
Communication is the hardest thing we do. And learning to listen is really more important than ever. And I don't know whether our modern technology and social media is a good thing or a bad thing for us. I think face-to-face interaction is very important, not only to pick up the subtle differences in what people are trying to communicate, but to build a relationship, a personal relationship with people. So I think face-to-face is still very important. Texting just doesn't do it. Emailing just doesn't do it. So I'm sorry to get on my high horse, but that's being more open-minded and learning to listen is really critical, I think, nowadays.
Hey, Mark, it might cause me to think something. And Jennifer, I want to just add one more thing. Another one of our classmates, we had a great class of 68 out of the Naval Academy, but Mike Mullen, who's former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee when asked about, back then, don't ask, don't tell, and should we allow people to serve in the military no matter what their sexual persuasion? And he said, I have come to believe that I grew up at the Naval Academy where we talked about honor, courage, and commitment. And one of the foremost tenets or core values being honor. I'm asking young men and women to give their lives for this country and lie about their own lifestyle. And I can no longer do that. He said, we have got to look at what they contribute and who they are and how they do their jobs. So I think for all of us to learn to sit back and look first and listen before you make a judgment about somebody, observe how they do their work. And once we did that, at least in the Marine Corps, we were startled at how many of us knew that people were gay or whatever else. It didn't matter because they were really good Marines, and we didn't want to take the chance of losing them to the organization.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have Martin Garcia.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Martin Garcia, and I'm the co-chair for the Connect to Veterans Employee Resource Group, Converge. Our mission at Converge is to help veterans in any way we can. My question is, how do we encourage branch and division chiefs to take a chance on giving someone else an opportunity that is not their usual go-to person? What advice would you have for the current cadre of supervisors, managers, leads as they embrace the fifth core element of NASA values, inclusion? Thank you.
Charlie, I'll go first if you don't mind. I think
I'm
it's
refer to you
important.
and Mark.
I think it's important for supervisors and managers, first of all, to get to know all of your people, get to know their backgrounds and their strengths and weaknesses, and then to challenge them. Okay. If a veteran has a lot of experience that I think is very valuable in any organization, if you will, the discipline you learn in the military is valuable. So I encouraged my supervisors and managers to challenge their people, give them something that you think may be a little beyond their experience or capability, and see how they perform. But first of all, you got to get to know your people and see who you think is capable of maybe a bridge too far, something like that. But don't be afraid to fail, for heaven's sakes. You're going to fail. If you're not failing occasionally, you're not trying hard enough. You know, Gene Kranz said it right, of course. Failure is not an option when lives are at stake. But when you're running an organization, challenge people. And if you fail occasionally, that's a learning experience.
Yeah, I think it was great. Mike said he's not a fan of texting, and I'm texting there. What I was trying to see is whether you guys can hang on for another 5 minutes, maybe. Do you think that's okay? Mike, do you have another 5 minutes? Good.
Yeah.
So we'll try to get a couple more questions, because I think the questions grew. What I would like to say, Martin, about that is, again, the boss has to get the attention. In general, under stress, under schedule pressure, I'm going to go to the people that I've already seen succeed. I know they can do it. I just don't want to deal with it, right? And Mike said it best. What happens is we get in a rut, and we give it to the same people, and we never see. And sometimes we're not pushing those other people to say, I want you to try this. Now the boss has to. They're taking a risk too, but I think that's real leadership to say, I may have to help this person more than I might have helped this other person, but I'm creating a capability for the next time that I'm going to have more than 2. I'm going to have 5 of these people. And really, I've had this experience where I was surprised, and it was a really good surprise. Boy, this person took off with that thing, you know. And I think so. You challenge them. That's what the boss is. I'm challenging you guys, and I want to understand this. And you can enforce it at the top, because I have center actions, and I don't always want to see the same people when I have a center action. So I can do that too. So that's a great question. So let's go back to Isidro. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Right. Next up, we have Kamwana Mwara.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to speak to us. I'm with the African American Employee Resource Group as this year's chair, and the question I had is, what advice do you have for those in the JAC community, especially those who may identify as belonging to an underrepresented? Sorry, can you hear me?
Okay, start over, because I missed your question.
Okay. So yeah, the question I had, and I'm with the African American Employee Resource Group. The question I had is, what advice do you have for those in the JAC community, especially those who identify as belonging to an underrepresented group, to best prepare and position themselves for leadership opportunities and roles at NASA as they arise, given the new transition of business for NASA? For example, the Commercial Crew Program, Gateway, and Artemis. Thank you.
Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, I'll make it real simple. My best advice to you is ask for assignments, ask for opportunities. Let people know that you're not afraid to take on a challenge, and in fact, I wouldn't say demand it, but tell people you're ready to take on more. That in the Marine Corps, one of the issues we're facing right now is people not wanting command, believe it or not. I find that flabbergasting, but not wanting to accept the responsibility that goes along with command and the risk to their career. So I think if you want to do something, let people know it.
Yeah, I started to say the same thing in answer to Martin. I think as individuals, you have a responsibility to look out for yourself, but that means stepping up and asking for additional responsibilities. I mean, supervisors and leaders are always looking for people who want to seize the initiative. Okay, so we have a responsibility to make sure they're aware that we as individuals want additional responsibilities, or even want a promotion, if you will. It comes down to the squeaky wheel gets the grease, if you will, but in fact, that's communication as well. If you know that people are eager to show what they can do, you're more likely to give them the challenge, if you will.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly before we go to the next question. It's a great question. I also think if you can seek out mentors too, and they can be informal mentors, and even across, not necessarily having to be within the same group that you're in, underrepresented group. And I think hopefully the leadership of the center it understands the importance of that now. But I think that can help too. Just have somebody go, hey, here's how I work through it, and this is the way the culture works. It can be very helpful. So anyway, great question.
All right,
Thank
Mark.
you.
Our final question from Mark, from Clark Esty.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm here as the co-chair for Emerge, JSC's early career resource or employee resource group. So the question I have for you is, going forward, how do you see JSC's culture adapting to the younger incoming generation? Do you foresee changes as welcome or to be met with resistance?
I'll be curious to hear Mark's response.
Yeah.
I tell you, my experience with the young engineers and the new people that we had coming in was they were very, very well educated, smart as the dickens, and they worked amazingly well as teams. I don't know exactly what the colleges were doing recently or 10 years ago when I was there, but obviously they trained you to work well as a team, and they tended to step in and contribute as part of a team right off the bat. So I was very delighted with the eagerness, enthusiasm of the young engineers coming in. I had very little criticism, and what I appreciated was they weren't afraid to ask questions. Step up, and the older you get, the more likely you are to ask dumb questions because you don't care anymore. But even the young people were asking questions, and occasionally, excuse me, one of those questions would be something nobody had thought of before, and that's especially priceless, if you will. So I was delighted that the young people I saw, the new engineers, were very outspoken. I hope that's still the case. I don't know if it is or not.
I'm passing to you, Mark.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So I raised 3 of them. 2 of them turned out to be engineers. So I have a different sense too from inside my house, how they behave. I think part of it is a good leader tries to make connections, right? So I try to understand from my kids what they're interested in, what drives them, what games, what social media. I am horrible at Twitter. God, I hate it. Sorry, did I say that out loud? So I have people that help me with that because those are important. More importantly, the center has to get really good at it because that's how we're communicating with people. So that's for internal and external. I think younger people today, and it's not everybody, younger people are not all alike. They're not. My 2 sons are not alike. So some of that we have to remember too. But I find a lot of them they're ready to be key players now. They want to be the go-to people now, where I remember kind of coming in and taking time and getting used to things. So you have to recognize that. You have to give them opportunities. You have to keep them energized. anyway, I think and a big organization which can be fairly bureaucratic struggles with that. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. But as Mike said, and I know Charlie's lived this too, they're they provide an incredible amount of energy to the system, new ideas, thinking differently, pushing on things that can be extremely beneficial, and we have to make sure we're pulling on that. So yeah, great question. But they're not all alike, just like any other group, you know. Some are outgoing, some are not outgoing, so you've got to find ways to connect with them in different ways. So anyway, yeah, great question. I don't think I've tweeted for like a month. Isidro, that's Isidro's fault because he's the guy who's trying to make sure that I tweet. Anyway, sorry. I think that's all the time we have for. So I'm sorry we didn't get to some of the other questions. I appreciate all the folks from the employee resource groups that came and prepared. Appreciate Monica and Stephanie for setting this up and getting us ready, and Jason and the folks from IRD. But especially Mike and Charlie, I really want to thank you. Both of you put us on a good path. It's our job to continue to push that path. And both of you are great leaders, really good people. I appreciated working for both of you, and I really appreciate your time today in sharing your stories, which are really, really powerful. So anyway, I want to thank you for that. Any final comments before we sign off? Okay. Well, thanks again. I look forward to seeing you in other venues in the future, I hope soon. And with that, we'll sign off. So thanks everybody who joined us today. Thanks for those that watched us live or in the recording. And thanks for everything you do for NASA and for diversity and inclusion.
Thanks to all of you.
Have a great day.
Yeah.